Today I'm introducing a zombie film with a more logical storyline, covering events from the early outbreak of the virus all the way to the collapse of the world, with the protagonist serving as a model of survival in an apocalypse, highly recommended for zombie enthusiasts. The main character, Nick, has just woken up from sleep when the news on TV once again reports on the new virus. With no effective treatment available, unrest has already broken out in several foreign regions, but Nick has long grown numb to such reports, always feeling they were far removed from his own life. It isn't until he visits the supermarket in the morning and notices far more people hoarding supplies than usual that he realizes the fear of the new virus is spreading. Still, Nick doesn't join the panic. He casually grabs a bag of cat food and returns home, where the TV continues to update the news, announcing that 2 cases of the virus have now been confirmed domestically. That night, Nick had his usual video call with his sister, but unlike her usual demeanor, she appeared unusually serious. She had just received notice that she would be boarding a special flight that evening to the Canary Islands. Because her husband worked for the military, the authorities had designated an island as a refuge for their families, and she worried that Nick would be too lonely, urging him to fly over the next day as well. Nick lay awake the entire night, thinking about how he once had a happy family of his own, until a sudden car accident claimed his wife's life. If not for the hospital dispatching a helicopter rescue, he too might not have survived. After recovering and leaving the hospital, the only family he had left was his cat, so naturally, if he were to evacuate to the Canary Islands, he couldn't possibly leave it behind. The radio broadcast delivered the latest update. The virus had mutated, and its incubation period was now drastically shorter, with symptoms appearing just minutes after infection. Not long after, Nick arrived at the departure hall with his cat, but just as he was about to board, a sudden announcement on the screen declared that all flights were cancelled. Almost instantly, everyone's phones buzzed with a government-issued emergency alert, declaring a temporary state of high alert. One passenger completely broke down and tried to force his way through the checkpoint. When security intervened, the man managed to snatch the gun from an officer's belt. Panic erupted as the crowd scattered in all directions, and Nick, swept along with them, fled the airport only to find himself stuck on the road home. Every route in and out of the city was jammed with cars, and the longer Nick waited, the more anxious he became. Realizing traffic wouldn't clear anytime soon, he pulled over, took his cat, and began walking home. As night fell, Nick finally reached his neighborhood, just as an ambulance sped past. Turning his head, he saw soldiers surrounding a neighbor's house, with a quarantine corridor set up leading directly to the front door. Confused, Nick soon witnessed his frenzied neighbor being forcibly dragged into the vehicle by 2 soldiers. Back at home, his mind remained unsettled. He hadn't expected the terrifying virus to strike so suddenly. After a restless night, he was awakened by a call from his sister, who had already arrived at the Canary Islands. She revealed that the authorities planned to establish quarantine zones to gather all residents in one place, but many in the military opposed the decision, warning that densely packed populations would only increase danger. She urged her brother to stay inside no matter what. After hanging up, Nick decided to head to the supermarket for supplies, but he wasn't the only one with that idea. The shelves had already been stripped bare. After struggling, Nick managed to grab a few cans of food. Watching fighter jets roar overhead, his heart sank and he immediately ran to the nearby gas station. The shop there had been closed for days but still held some supplies. Just as he finished gathering items and was about to leave, the cashier, clutching an injured arm, ran inside and locked himself in. Moments later, several residents screamed and scattered, when suddenly a figure lunged down from above, tackling a policeman to the ground. Instinctively, Nick tried to intervene, grabbing a water pipe, but the attacker turned on him instead. Just then, a gunshot rang out from behind. The fallen officer had fired his weapon. At the same time, the shopkeeper inside began to mutate as well. Feeling the world was unraveling far too quickly, Nick snatched up his backpack and hurried away. Once back home, he carefully followed his sister's advice, reinforcing his yard inside and out, and even installing a surveillance camera at the entrance. That night, a squad of soldiers came to the neighborhood, knocking on doors one by one as they tried to organize residents to move to designated quarantine sites. Nick lay still on the floor, ignoring the relentless pounding on his door until the soldiers grew tired and moved on to the next house. 2 weeks passed in the blink of an eye. Surviving with the help of solar charging, Nick managed to scrape by, but his food supply had completely run out, forcing him to venture out in search of provisions. Once an experienced diving enthusiast, he put his old gear to use, suiting up and reinforcing the limbs of his wetsuit for protection. Even if he encountered the infected, he would still have a fighting chance. Unfortunately, after searching through several neighboring houses, he found nothing. It wasn't until he stepped into a room with its door left ajar that he unexpectedly came across an elderly woman. It turned out the elderly woman was paralyzed from the waist down, and with her daughter long married and gone, no one had helped her during the earlier evacuations. Nick felt deep sympathy for her situation, but he had no extra food to spare. The woman only chuckled, saying she knew everything about the area. With her guidance, Nick was able to gather plenty of supplies and even came across a motorcycle, which gave him the means to travel farther for resources. Their lives gradually improved, and Nick found comfort in having someone by his side, hoping they could simply wait out the virus together. Then one night, the old woman urged Nick to switch on the radio. A faint female voice crackled through, announcing that the government's quarantine zones had completely collapsed. She told any survivors to head to the Rosar River port, where she would be waiting with a boat to take them to the Canary Islands. Hearing the broadcast, Nick's heart stirred. Wasn't that exactly where his sister had evacuated? He decided he would take the old woman there the next day, but she refused, citing her immobility. Nick earnestly insisted he would never abandon a companion. Early the next morning, after packing his things, he tried to reach her on the walkie-talkie, but there was no reply. A sense of dread filled him as he rushed to her home, only to find a note on the table that read, "I hope you can live well." The old woman had taken her own life, determined not to hold Nick back. Grief weighed heavily on him, and on his way back, his distraction proved costly. An infected suddenly tackled him to the ground. Fighting desperately, Nick flung open a car door to knock the creature away. Then, as it lunged at him again, he quickly grabbed a spear gun and struck back. Back home, Nick carefully cleaned his arrows and made sure he had everything he needed before setting off on his small motorcycle toward the riverbank. But before that, he deliberately stopped by the nearest quarantine site. Though the roadblocks were still in place, the living tents had long since collapsed into ruins, confirming that the voice on the radio had spoken the truth. Heading to the Canary Islands was now his only option. As he rode along a mountain road, hordes of infected suddenly surged out from both sides. Nick slammed down on the throttle, cold sweat running down his back, and before he knew it, he had fled into a temporary settlement. Determined to push through, he pressed on, but more infected burst out from the tents, throwing him into a full-blown panic. Stumbling wildly, he barely managed to break out of the camp, only to be confronted by a pile of corpses. Startled, he lost control and crashed to the ground with his bike, and just as the infected closed in, the motorcycle broke down at the worst possible moment. In desperation, he had no choice but to abandon the motorcycle and run on foot. Fortunately, the river port wasn't far. Nick carried his cat, his legs burning from exhaustion, and finally reached the entrance first, but the glass door was too fragile and quickly shattered under the pressure of the frenzied infection. Using both hands and feet, he scrambled into the safety of a fenced area, narrowly escaping the pursuing zombies, yet he felt no relief. The port was filled with boats, but there wasn't a single survivor in sight, and he had no way of knowing if the kind person on the radio had already set off or been infected. Ignoring the uncertainty, Nick grabbed a speedboat and headed toward the Canary Islands, passing several overturned boats along the way, a grim testament to what their passengers must have endured. Suddenly, the speedboat came to a halt on its own. Nick lifted the propeller out of the water and found a corpse tangled in the blades. A chill ran down his spine. Was he about to be trapped and die at sea? Unexpectedly, a large ship appeared in the distance, and Nick waved his arms in excitement. Before long, he was brought aboard, only to discover the captain was a foreigner. Their conversation had to be conducted through a translator, answering many strange and confusing questions. The translator led Nick to a guest room, and curious about the absence of other survivors, Nick asked, only for the translator's expression to change, revealing that he was the first. That night, however, Nick saw a family arrive in a small boat seeking help. The next day, when he asked the translator whether they had been rescued, he was told not to ask anything. Suspicious, Nick walked alone to the ship's railing and noticed the kayak from the previous day had been salvaged, with a crew member searching through backpacks nearby. At that moment, he fully realized he had boarded a ship of thieves. Nick quietly approached the translator, suspecting he too was trapped by circumstances, and proposed that they escape together, knowing a hospital nearby had a helicopter they could use to reach the Canary Islands. However, the translator, who happened to be a pilot, immediately refused, warning Nick not to cause trouble if he wanted to survive, leaving Nick to figure out a way to escape alone. That night, after preparing his gear and ready to leave the cabin, he remembered that people often came and went behind a certain door. Driven by curiosity, Nick sneaked inside and found the family that had called for help the day before, though 2 women were missing. He hurriedly unlocked their restraints, but the man shouted to rescue his wife and daughter, only to be shot by guards who suddenly appeared. Nick feared he was doomed, when suddenly the translator arrived. The guard, caught off guard, was attacked without warning. Nick watched in shock as the translator killed the guard. It turned out he had finally decided to join Nick in the escape. Under cover of darkness, the 2 moved stealthily to the ship's edge, but just as they boarded a speedboat, a patrolling guard spotted them. Nick quickly started the engine while the translator covered him with his gun, but his arm was unfortunately shot. Luckily, the speedboat had already moved out of range. Nick drove the boat to the shore and carried the injured translator to a nearby parking lot, searching until they finally found a working vehicle. He sped toward the hospital, knowing the wound would be fatal if left untreated. Driving through deserted roads, the city ahead looked utterly lifeless, but they finally reached the hospital. Nick was nearly frantic when he saw there was no helicopter on the tarmac. At that moment, a horde of infected, drawn by the noise, began approaching. In a fit of rage, Nick opened fire and wiped them all out. His chance to reunite with his sister was once again lost, and he decided to focus on treating the translator's wound first. As Nick prepared the disinfectants, he heard the voices of children coming through the ventilation ducts. Curious, he followed the sound and soon spotted 2 kids peeking out from a vent. Just then, an infected approached from behind. Nick spun around and struck it down with his spear gun, but the commotion drew the attention of a large group of infected. Sprinting like an athlete, he dashed back to the operating room, only to find the injured translator gone and the infected about to break in. A female doctor emerged from the duct, and Nick quickly followed her inside, narrowly escaping the pursuing horde. It turned out the hospital contained a secure zone where the director and nurses were sheltering with several children. The translator had already been brought there first, but his injuries were severe and required immediate surgery. Before long, the doctor successfully removed the bullet from his body, and Nick couldn't help but wonder where the helicopter had gone. The female doctor led him to the rooftop terrace, revealing that the helicopter was normally parked in the hospital's backyard, but the entrance and exit were blocked by infected. Nick refused to give up, running up multiple times to observe the terrain, when he unexpectedly spotted a group of armed men entering from below, the same crew from the ship. Nick suggested taking the helicopter immediately, and the doctor agreed, knowing their supplies were nearly gone. Carefully, the group made their way through the corridors, only to find one door locked. Nick fetched an axe, but just as he pried it open, an infected burst out, knocking the director to the ground. The group worked together to subdue it, only to realize the director had been bitten and could do nothing but watch him turn and leave. The doctor felt sorrowful, yet she still had a far more urgent mission to carry out. Before long, they reached the backyard gate, and through the window Nick saw it swarming with infected. He came up with a bold plan, arranging shelves into a circle to enclose everyone, then quietly moved halfway across the yard. The infected were finally alerted, but even when they rushed forward, they posed little immediate threat. Nick blocked the zombies attempting to climb in while pushing the metal frames forward, eventually reaching the fence entrance. The doctor forcibly pried open the lock, leading everyone onto the tarmac while the metal frames conveniently blocked the entry. The translator immediately jumped onto the helicopter, and though Nick relocked the gate, zombies began climbing over the fence. As he struggled, unable to free himself, the ship's gang suddenly appeared, rushing toward him with their accomplices. They quickly shot the zombies at the gate and threatened the translator to come out of the helicopter. Nick subtly signaled him, then turned to chop open another iron gate behind him, letting a flood of infected rush in. Nick hid behind the gate, and once the ship's gang was wiped out, the translators started the helicopter just in time. With few infected left in the area, Nick swung his weapon to take down the last of them, then leapt to grab the helicopter's rope. After a near-death struggle, everyone was finally able to head toward a new refuge. But just as they neared the Canary Islands, Nick's phone regained signal, and he received a call from his sister. To his shock, her tone was frantic. She urged him not to come, because even the Canary Islands had fallen. That concludes the entire story.